So it's the middle of a week on a Wednesday, so let's jump into some Patreon listener questions. Again, if you want to be part of the Transformer Slag podcast Patreon, help support the podcast. Let us know we're doing a half-decent job here in the Transformer world. Again, patreon.com/Protoman, or check the pinned comment or the description below. What does that get you if you join the Patreon? Get to your name in the end credit scroll at the end of every segment moving forward. Access to the exclusive Discord, where we break the news, talk about the news, share lore, share downloads, share Transformer sales, save money on your hobby. That's the most important thing in these crazy times, is to save money on that hobby. And of course, depending on what tier, you get a little something in the mail, or even a chance to ask the Patreon listener question. We got two today. The reason why I'm putting these two together, because they're very similar in flavor in a lot of ways, and it has to do with market and location and timing. And I figured I'd put these two together just because it's kind of a conversation together. So I'll start with the first one here, and it comes from T-Formers 2002, longtime patron. He wants to know, hey Proto, so for the last 20 years, the Masterpiece Transformers line has been giving us what designers hope to be the best representation of our favorite characters. And although the main focus is on G1, it hasn't stopped Takara-tomy from branching out into other series that are also Japanese exclusive stuff, the Bayverse stuff, or even the Brave stuff. And at this point, it seems like we're getting around 4 to 5 announcements every year. So my question is, do you think this will eventually end? What happens 30 to 40 years from now, or dare I say, characters like Cyberverse Clobber or even BotBot's Burgertron have their time in the spotlight on this line? Those may never happen, but it's something I think about. Keep up the great work, dude. T-Formers 2002. So I'll start with T-Formers this question. Now, 30 to 40 years from now for the Masterpiece line, who knows where we will be in the Transformer world. I mean, I can't even imagine where we might be 5 years from now, considering how the world is right now, how plastic costs is, how the toy industry is changing so much, and how stuff is really slipping in the toy industry in a lot of ways. And I don't want to sound negative about it, but I mean, 30 to 40 years from now, who knows? Who knows? But I will say this. It's not so much, you could predict the future by guessing, but you could predict the future by looking to the past. And when you look at the Masterpiece line, there is a strong emphasis on Generation 1, because that seems to be the market that is willing to spend that kind of money. And keep in mind, and this is going to also bleed into the second question here that we have later, but keep in mind, Masterpiece is a Japanese market line. It's made for Japan first, and everything that kind of happens afterwards is secondary. If the American market doesn't receive that new Masterpiece release very well, it's not a big deal to them. That was not 100% in the cards to begin with. If it was, there would be localized importation on a retail scale of the Masterpiece line, like there was at one point for the G1 stuff. It still is for the movie stuff, but the G1 stuff just doesn't have its place anymore. And it's just really aimed at the Japanese market. And if they put it on Hasbro Pulse, or if you pick it up at an online store, hey, all the better for you. But what I'm trying to get at with that is they constantly think about those characters and those choices based on the Japanese market, and they will flex accordingly to that. The movie stuff, the reason why we have retail versions of them here is because it has such a huge market in China, and they're able to make so many more units of it to the point that it can have a retail footprint and available in a Target, or at the time at least when the United States had it, a Toys R Us. And it's just something that we're going to see more movie stuff in the future, because it's constantly evolving. New movie comes out, they put out new product, even in the Masterpiece line. Brave died, on arrival. They tried it didn't work out, and that was a Japanese market only thing. The way I see it is, I look at, when we got our first Beast Wars Masterpiece, which was MP32 Beast Convoy, aka Optimus Primal. And that came out in 2016 of, I want to say it was the end of the year of 2016. I want to say like October, November. And that was celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Beast Wars brand. So the brand was 20 years old in both, the American region, and in Japan it was actually 19 years old only at that point. But because they got it in 97. But the point is that it was a brand that was old enough that the older demo that grew up on it could now have nostalgia for it and be willing to pay for, those characters and that product. Not to mention Beast Wars was ridiculously popular in its inception and only grew more popular as it got older. Where you gave examples of like Cyberverse Clobber or BotBot's Burgertron. Those were good series. Those individual characters and those series didn't exactly move the needle, where Beast Wars did move the needle. Beast Wars was ridiculously successful in its initial run. And again, going back to the Michael Bay stuff, also ridiculously successful, and why all of those, especially the 2007 movie designs, have masterpiece equivalencies. Because those will sell well because there's a huge cultural imprint. So like 30 years from now, would we get Clobber? I don't know about that. Maybe a Burgertron, maybe the face of a brand, but definitely not that deep into it, considering like, look how, to say, hey, are we going to get a Clobber Cyberverse masterpiece when we don't even have a masterpiece of a Predacon outside of obviously Beast Wars Megatron, Black Arachnia, and related repaints like a, Shadow Panther, I guess, is the best example. But I don't know. It's something where, and not to mention, like I said, as time progresses, they're going to revisit old characters again. Beast Convoy 2.0. They're going to revisit, Hot Rod again. They're going to revisit Prowl again. They're going to revisit the Lambor brothers. Who knows? Like they're going to do the same thing also, where they do that with Gundam, or the original RX-78 classic original Gundam. You think, they made the best model kit, and then they revisit it over and over and over, and we tweaked it a little bit, now it's a little more better, and it's going to be kind of the same thing here too, where in 30 to 40 years from now, we'll probably have a lot of characters ticked off on the list of who needs to be done. But I think also a lot will be revisited. And for you to say will there be an eventual end? No, I don't think so. I think Masterpiece, as long as it's still feasible financially, will still keep going forever. And there'll still be a Bumblebee release every 10 years or something, a Starscream release, a Soundwave release. I could see it happening. I mean, and going to the 20-year thing with Beast Convoy, I mean, look what's happening in 2022. While we're not getting a Armada Optimus Prime in any shape or form really from the official capacity, look what third party's doing. It's 2022. That's the 20th anniversary of Transformers Armada, aka Micron Legend in Japan. And clearly the third party guys, even though it's apples and oranges in terms of production and everything like that, there's a market for it if they're willing to take the chance because they see it. And Micron and Armada did pretty good. Didn't do amazing, but it did pretty good. Definitely did better than Cyberverse and BotBots did in terms of numbers and pop culture. So, and I love Cyberverse, don't get me wrong, but I mean, we'll see. We'll see what happens. It's tough to say 20 to 30 years or 30 to 40 years even, but I will say this, it'll keep going. They're going to keep focusing on G1 characters, and when a certain anniversary comes around, or when a certain distance of time comes and that character has enough equity and I guess prestige to be able to get a masterpiece, they will do it. Like don't expect like a MP. I'm trying to think of something that'd be kind of like left field, like MP, Energon Optimus Prime. Like I don't really see that ever happening from a Takara official capacity, but Transformers Prime, yeah, I could see it. I could see Transformers Prime, Optimus Prime getting a masterpiece. Would it be necessary? I'm pretty sure they could tweak it enough to make it worth people's while. They could do some kind of it's the 20th anniversary of Transformers Prime, and so we're going to do Optimus Prime, and then they'll do a Megatron after. I could see it. I could see something like that. Animated I'd love to see too, but I don't know. Animated seems to be like the don't say anything about it kind of thing. I don't know why. Like, they never want to give the animated love. Very weird. We're going to get into the second question because it's also kind of related to it in a lot of ways, but we also have the Collector Prime with his question. He says, "Hey, Proto, I'm a marketer, so maybe you can help me. I'd be interesting if we got a deep dive into the differences between the Japanese audience and the North American audience when it comes to cartoon and anime, and especially toys. You touch on it from time to time, but a comprehensive view would be really interesting. Thank you for your time, the Collector Prime." Thank you, Collector Prime, for that question. And again, that falls into the difference between the Japanese and the American audience. And I mean, if you really want to go deep into his question here, the differences between those two audiences have changed over the past 20 years. It used to be Transformers as a brand was a very young aiming demographic. It was, in Japan to begin with, the expectation is kids play with toys between about 3 to about like 7, 8 years old, where in America that was a wider band. It could be like 3 to 12. So there was an expectation in Japan many years ago that kids stop playing with toys after a certain age, and the only ones that are still buying and collecting toys are weird otakus. It was just a very different kind of mentality back in, like, let's say the late 90s, early 2000s. 20 years later, that has changed a lot, and Japan, with low birth rates and it being a mostly adult audience out there that's collecting all kinds of science fiction related stuff, the whole industry has shifted. Cartoons has shifted, anime has shifted, comic books has shifted, and of course toys have shifted. Stuff has become more complex, stuff has become more collector oriented, stuff has become more expensive because it's collector oriented. And while there is toys for younger kid demos, there's a lot more that is for an older demo, with the birth of SH Figuarts and Figmas, and I could go on and on with all the anime figure stuff. Just go to any anime action figure website that sells, and you're going to see just the plethora of product that exists that really didn't exist in the late 90s and early 2000s because of where the headspace was at the time. Those guys who were 5 years old in the 90s, they're 25 now, they're 30, they got their first job, they have disposable income in Japan, and so they want to relive their childhood. On the flip side of it, guys who are in their 20s in the late 90s are in their 40s, and they also have money. But there isn't as much younger kids in Japan, so it is heavily an adult collector market. And that's why all our cool stuff, all our cool Transformers, our cool products, our more adult skewed kind of stuff comes mostly from Japan, because that's that market. The North American market still believes that toys are for kids, but it's the old saying, actions speak louder than words. And while they still believe toys are for kids, and they still try to believe that toys are for kids, go into the action figure aisle. It's collector-oriented 6-inch Marvel Legends, Star Wars Black Series, extremely expensive Transformer toys aimed at a collector market. Even go to the wrestling section. 50% of the wrestling action figures are based on wrestlers that haven't wrestled in 20 years. And that tells you right there, a kid, you could say, oh, the kid's watching YouTube and that's why he wants to own a Bret Hart figure or Hulk Hogan. No, it's really aimed at the older demo, because kids, the reality is they don't really care about toys. And sure, there's going to be someone in the comments going to say, well, my son or my niece or nephew loves toys. Yeah, they do for now, but we'll see what happens, because as someone who has ran conventions for 20 years, who has ran other people's conventions for 20 years, and most importantly, and this is the key one, when you're running conventions and you're just sitting at the entrance, and all you have to do is just meet the people who come in and make a note of who's walking in and who's walking out, and you see that you rarely see children anymore, and when you do, sometimes they're dragged there. They really are. It's like they almost don't even want to be there. So it's a very different demo in the North American market. But the Japanese market too, it's very similar, but it's more so due to there's less kids now. There's a lower birth rate in Japan. That's a whole other social discussion. And there's a huge just focus on adult collectibles out there in that market. It's nuts. It's absolutely nuts. And I mean, again, that goes back to the Masterpiece question with T-Formers 2002, which is why Masterpiece is really a Japanese line. And it's not really 100% something for the Western market, because there still is that stigma where it's like, well, we could convince people to spend $20 to $30 to $40 on a toy at Target or Walmart, or a Funko Pop even, if you want to really go down that rabbit hole. But to get them to spend $150, we're not there yet. At least in the Western retail mind. They're still like, oh, it'd have to be a big play set or something. So they're still not there yet. They're slowly, once in a while, something secretes out there from the Masterpiece movie line or something. But in general, they try to avoid that because it's a lot of overhead for the stores to carry and stuff like that. But in the Japanese market, there's a lot more confidence because there is people that are spending that big kind of money. And getting into like even video games and stuff, it's the same thing. Like look how much people spend on nostalgia stuff, Nintendo classics and Nintendo Amiibo products and everything like that. Or they did the Game & Watches recently that people were scalping. Like the second you aim something at that 20 to 40-year-old demo, that demographic, you all of a sudden could charge more because people are going to pay more. So that goes into a whole deeper discussion when it comes to like, just demographics and marketing and everything. But the difference is, again, going back to the original question, the difference between those two markets is the Japanese market skews older. And because it skews older, the material is going to be more complex and it's going to be more adult marketed. Where, I mean, let's put it this way. There's no BotBots in Japan. They didn't bring it over there. The Cyberverse line was brought over to Japan in a very limited capacity. Now, here's something that isn't part of your question. North American market, Japanese market, but then here's the third market, the Chinese market. Chinese market has an extreme boom of younger demographics. When you're talking I think it's 1.4 billion people in China, and a good chunk of those are having children, that's a huge hole to fill for marketing to children and kids and stuff like that. And I think that that's actually kind of another demo that you'd have to think about too and have that discussion. Cyberverse heavily marketed in China to the point that it was going to have its own spin-off series in Neza. So that's another conversation for another time. But I hope that kind of answers the question a little bit. Gives you guys a little bit of an idea, and me rambling for a near 20 minutes or so. Hopefully it's entertaining to you and you could take something away from it. But that kind of gives you a little bit of an idea. Again, the Japanese market has always been one that I like. It has unfortunately a short-term future because it makes you wonder what happens when that older demo ages out and that younger demo that is pretty absent isn't there to fill it in. That makes it kind of dangerous for the future of a brand and its market. But, like anything else in the world, stuff kind of disappears over time. You reach a point where when Transformer fans are going to be in their 70s and 80s, is there going to be something there to replace it from the Transformer brand, or is there something there to replace it that isn't Transformers at all? That could be video games. That could be the Pokemon fandom. That could be whatever comes afterwards. That's the next hip thing with children. And that might not even be toy related. That could be a whole other discussion completely, in that what might replace Transformers in 70 to 80 years, because it might not even be plastic action figures and a big brand centering around it. It could be just a very popular mobile game. But that's a whole other story. Hope that answers those questions. Again, if you want to be part of the Patreon and join the crew and just hang out with us in the Discord, or just want to support the podcast, again, patreon.com/Protoman, or check the pinned comment or the description below. And again, thank you for the awesome questions from T-Formers 2002 and the Collector Prime. And like I always say, rock out with the robots in disguise.